Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the America's Founding Series, part of the P.A.S. Report podcast. As your host, Nick Giordano, I'm glad you could join me. Make sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with 3 or 4 great patriots, because we're witnessing something that's pretty interesting. And I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a street. Doesn't matter if it's Broadway in 1788 or the thoroughfares in Minnesota today. The air feels heavy, not with rain, but with a specific kind of electricity, the kind that pulses through a crowd right before it turns into a raging mob. You see, a group is forming, and at first it begins as a protest. People have a grievance. And then something changes, something snaps. Those protesting decide that they are the law, and they're going to be the ones to determine what laws are enforced and which ones aren't. The shouting becomes threats. Law enforcement is no longer seen as a protector of the peace. It's seen as a target, an obstacle to get your way, and a relic of a system that the crowd has decided is illegitimate. And what happens in that moment? What happens when a mob decides that it's the one that's in charge, that its passion is more valid than a statute, a congressionally passed law, than the system itself? See, this isn't a modern problem of what we're witnessing over in Minnesota. This isn't a product of a 21st century news cycle. One of America's most essential founders lived through this exact moment. He stood in the middle of the street. He didn't just watch the glass break. He felt the impact of that glass, the violence firsthand, and it permanently shaped how he understood freedom. And his name was John Jay. Now, you probably have heard of John Jay before. He's more popular than the patriots I usually focus on, but I thought John Jay was a fitting episode for this week because he was a revolutionary. He was a diplomat. He was our first Chief Justice. He believed in liberty with his entire soul, but he feared something even more than he feared King George. He feared the mob. And if we want to understand what is happening in our country today, we have to understand the hard-earned wisdom of John Jay. He is so important, such a central figure to our history. And to understand him, we have to look at who he was before the statues were even built. Born into a world of privilege in New York, Jay was a man of law. He was disciplined, educated, deeply steeped in the idea of the social compact. And when the British began their long train of abuses, John Jay didn't hesitate to join the cause. He was a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He was an early revolutionary, but he was not one of the more romantic ones. Last week, I talked about Thomas Paine. This week, John Jay, he was more steeped in reality. And while others were writing poetic odes to the people as an abstract, as a perfect force, Jay was asking a much more grounded, much more dangerous question. Who protects the individual when the crowd is angry? And Jay made a distinction that we often fail to make today. He wasn't an anti-revolution. He was anti-lawlessness. He believed that the only reason to overthrow a tyrant was to replace his whim with the rule of law. See, to Jay, law wasn't a barrier to freedom. It was the very condition of it. Without law, liberty doesn't exist. Freedom is just the ability of the strong to bully the weak. He watched as the American Revolution began to devour its own principles in the early days. He saw the committees of safety in New York replacing actual courts. He saw neighbors branded as traitors and having their homes burned without a trial. He realized early on that a revolution can overthrow a king and still destroy liberty if it allows the law to collapse. See, he believed that unrestrained popular passion is just another form of despotism. It's just a king with 1,000 heads instead of one. And if we look to Minneapolis, what do you think is going to happen if those people ever get in charge? What do you think they would do? In April of 1788, the American experiment was on a knife's edge. The Constitution has been written, but it wasn't yet the law of the land. New York was a powder keg. And a rumor began to circulate that medical students at the local hospital were stealing bodies from graveyards for dissection. It was a sensitive and emotional issue. A mob of 5,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population, descended on the hospital. They weren't looking for a trial or an investigation. They were looking for blood. The governor called out the militia, but the soldiers were paralyzed. They weren't handing out donuts and coffee like Tim Walz has ordered the National Guard of Minnesota to do. But they didn't want to fire on their neighbors. They didn't want to be seen as oppressors of the people's will. Now, John Jay, who was serving as the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, didn't stay home. He didn't wait for a committee report. He joined Alexander Hamilton at the steps of the jailhouse where the doctors were being held for their own protection. And Jay stood his ground. He tried to speak to the crowd. He tried to remind the crowd that there is a process for grievances. And a rock sailed out of the darkness, struck Jay in the temple, nearly killing him. He was bedridden for weeks. But as he recovered, his resolve hardened. He realized something chilling, that once a mob learns it can override the law, it never stops on its own. It doesn't satisfy itself and just go home. In fact, it grows, it replicates, it becomes a beast that eats the very republic that gave it a voice. And I want to focus on that when we get back from a quick break. So everyone, hang tight, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. report. We're talking about John Jay, and before the break, he was recovering from being attacked by the mob. Now, John Jay, this is a guy, one of the principal authors of the Federalist Papers, and he wrote a lot of the early essays, 2, 3, 4, 5. His focus wasn't just on foreign policy. It was on the necessity of a government that could restrain all power. See, he argued that we need a national government not just to protect us from kings from across the ocean, but to protect us from the local circumstances of hope and fear that lead people astray. In Jay's mind, the hierarchy was clear. Kings must be restrained, legislators must be restrained, presidents must be restrained, and yes, the mob itself must be restrained. His key insight, which we find in his Federalist thinking, is that liberty survives only when law is superior to force. It doesn't matter if that force wears a crown or carries the banner in the street in protest. If force can override law, you don't have a republic. You have a power struggle going on. So if people are successful in Minneapolis, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think those people are just going to go home, say, all right, we won, and now ICE isn't enforcing past laws that Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, passed, that gave ICE the statutory authority to enforce these laws? Or do you think we're going to see what happened in Minneapolis replicated in every single urban center in this country? Now, Jay believed the Constitution was a firewall. It wasn't just a shield against the central government. It was a shield against the temporary delusions of the people themselves. And he famously understood that the people are sovereign of this country. But that wasn't unlimited. And this is the part we tend to forget, because he insisted we're only sovereign through the channels that they built, that we built. The people are the bosses, but they agreed to follow the rules that they wrote. The moment they step outside those rules, they aren't exercising their sovereignty. They're actually forfeiting it. See, we built a system to protect the system from the people, the system from the system, the people from the system, and the people from themselves. But what happens when most people have no idea about the Constitution? Most people don't even understand the basic premise of federalism and the founding of our government. What happens when the majority, overwhelming majority of people never even read the Constitution? That they demand is out of date, that they demand should be abolished. And if we look at the present, it's what we're seeing in Minnesota and across several parts of our country. We are witnessing a direct rejection of John Jay's architect of order. We see coordinated, organized crowds declaring that certain federal laws are illegitimate despite being passed by Congress. We see local officials refusing to enforce these laws that were passed by Congress because they fear the passion of the street, and they also don't like the President of the United States. We see law enforcement, ICE officers being portrayed as an immoral force simply for doing the job of enforcing the statutes on the books. They're being labeled as Nazis and fascists. This isn't about one specific policy. And I want to make it very clear, this goes far beyond immigration enforcement. This is about America herself. That's what they really don't like. I mean, let's just look at the facts. You look at the George Floyd riots. You look at the pro-Palestinian mobs commandeering college campuses, stopping traffic, causing disruption everywhere. And you look at the current situation right now. It's the same people, the same rhetoric, and it's all about bringing down the United States. That's what it's about. That's why I say it's not about a specific policy. It isn't even about enforcement discretion. It's about the rejection of the legitimacy of the United States of America and the law itself. And Jay warned us about this. He warned that once law becomes optional, freedom becomes conditional. And if a group in a major city can decide that a federal law that they don't like doesn't apply, then they believe the law doesn't exist. Now imagine we take that to property rights, and you look at New York City and Mamdani and his socialist housing czar that says property is white privilege, property is white supremacy, and that we got to make it for the collective. You have people that are openly speaking about nullification. You're talking about public officials like Governor Walz, like Mayor Frey, and you're talking about the mob trying to nullify federal law. Jay would have looked at the current unrest and seen a mirror of what he saw in 1788. He would have seen people who believe their moral outrage gives them license to bypass the social compact, that people believe that they are morally superior to everyone else and that they get to decide, despite the fact that we had an election in 2024 and the people spoke in the voting booth. And Jay's life teaches us that when you bypass the law to achieve justice, you end up with neither. And the most dangerous lie in a republic is the idea that the mob is the people. John Jay dedicated his life to the truth, that the two are not the same. And when we look at truth, we're operating in this bizarre world where the left wants to redefine truth to basically mean whatever they want it to mean. But the fact of the matter is, truth exists in the nature of everything. And it doesn't depend on my acceptance, your acceptance of it, to give it its binding force of validity. Whether we accept it or not, truth exists. We created law. Human beings created law to restrain everyone, including themselves, because we are flawed creatures. And the mob uses force to exempt themselves from the law. When mobs decide which laws apply and which do not, you don't have liberty anymore. You have a struggle for dominance, a street fight going on. And in that struggle, the first thing to be sacrificed is the rights of the individual. Just look at how individuals are being stopped on the street, harassed if they're even suspected of being an ICE agent. You have people that have no business conducting law enforcement activities, demanding to see licenses, demanding to see papers, demanding who gets access into these neighborhoods and who doesn't. Anyone that's walking around with a piece of clothing that slightly has any patriotic overtones to it is harassed. The mob circle them and they make them take it off. As we watch these events unfold in Minnesota, we have to ask ourselves a question that John Jay left for us. Who decides what the law is? Is it the representatives we elected, the Constitution that we ratified? Or is it going to be the loudest, most aggressive group in the square? And how well do you think that's going to work out for us if that's the case? John Jay understood something we are dangerously close to forgetting. A republic, it doesn't fall when laws are debated. Debate is a sign of healthy republic. These people want to protest. Go out and protest. You want to have this debate? Let's have this debate. But that's not what we're seeing. And a republic falls when people decide they no longer need the law at all. A republic falls when people forget and don't understand and were never educated about the principles of our system and how the system actually operates. And Jay's challenge is for us to remember that the channels of law are the only thing standing between us and anarchy, the only thing standing between us and the rock that hit him in the head in 1788. We can have a system of order, or we can have the rule of the street, but we can't have both. We have to choose. Which one are you going to choose? Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give the America's Founding Series, the P.A.S. Report podcast, 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Take 30 seconds to write a good review and share this episode. Share it with 4 to 5 other great patriots so that they too can learn about our history and understand that what we're witnessing today is not unique. It's been a struggle in the United States before, and we could overcome it. But we could only overcome it if we have the knowledge on how to push back against it. I want to thank you for listening to this week's America's Founding series, part of the P.A.S. Report podcast, and I'll be back next week with more great episodes.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.